The yacht party sparkled under the stars that night. Everyone who was anyone in New York City was there, drinking champagne worth more than most people made in a month. Damien Cross stood at the helm of his million-dollar yacht, looking down at his guests like a king surveying his kingdom. At 45, he had everything money could buy: perfectly tailored suits, a penthouse in Manhattan, and more zeros in his bank account than most people could count. But something was missing. He just didn't know it yet. Isla Reyes wasn't supposed to be there that night. She was just a waitress at a small diner in Brooklyn, trying to make ends meet and help her sick mother with medical bills. But when one of the catering staff called in sick, she jumped at the chance to work at the fancy party. Maybe she'd make enough in tips to cover this month's rent. She moved through the crowd with a tray of champagne, trying to blend in with the other servers. But she couldn't help staring at all the diamonds and designer dresses. 1 month's worth of jewelry these people wore could pay for her mother's entire treatment. Then she overheard something that made her stop in her tracks. 2 men in expensive suits were talking about buying out a chain of family restaurants in Brooklyn, including the diner where she worked. They were going to tear them all down to build luxury condos. Those little places are worthless anyway. One man laughed. Who cares about a bunch of greasy spoons? Isla's blood boiled. That greasy spoon was where her mother had worked for 20 years before getting sick. It was where Isla had grown up, doing homework in the back booth while her mom served coffee. Without thinking, she marched right up to the men. Those restaurants feed families, she said, her voice shaking. They're people's livelihoods. You can't just destroy them. The party went quiet. Everyone turned to stare at the waitress who dared to speak up. Damien Cross himself walked over, his expensive shoes clicking on the deck. Who let this girl on board? He asked, looking at Isla like she was something stuck to his shoe. I'm sorry, sir, the catering manager stammered. She was filling in for get her off my yacht, Damien ordered. Now. 2 security guards grabbed Isla's arms. She struggled, spilling champagne on Damien's custom suit. You're heartless, she yelled as they dragged her to the rail. You think money makes you better than everyone else? Damien wiped the champagne from his sleeve with a look of disgust. I am better, and you're nothing. Throw her overboard. The guards hesitated. Sir, we can't do it. She can swim to shore. Maybe it'll teach her to mind her own business. Before anyone could stop them, the guards lifted Isla and tossed her over the rail. She hit the cold water with a splash, gasping as the waves pulled at her uniform. The yacht's lights grew smaller as it sailed away, leaving her treading water in the dark ocean. What no one noticed was the storm brewing on the horizon. Dark clouds gathered, bringing wind and rain that would change everything. Because sometimes fate has a way of teaching the cruelest lessons to those who need them most. Little did Damien know that in a few hours he would lose everything. His yacht, his power, and his carefully controlled world. And the only person who could help him survive would be the very woman he had just thrown away like trash. The party continued as the first drops of rain began to fall. Damien went back too, his champagne already forgetting about the waitress who dared to challenge him. But the sea never forgets. And it was about to teach both of them a lesson about what really matters in life. Dark clouds covered the moon as Isla swam toward the distant shore. Her arms ached and her clothes weighed her down, but anger kept her going. She'd survived worse than this. She'd show that arrogant billionaire that you couldn't break someone's spirit by throwing them into the ocean. She had no way of knowing that very soon she would see Damien Cross again. And when she did, he wouldn't be a powerful billionaire anymore. He would be just a man, cold, wet, and desperate for help. Her help. Sometimes life has a way of bringing people together in the strangest ways. And sometimes the person you think you hate the most becomes the only one who can save you, or the only one worth saving. The storm hit without warning. Lightning split the sky as waves crashed against Damien's yacht. Guests screamed and held onto whatever they could find as the boat pitched violently in the churning sea. Everyone below deck, Damien shouted over the howling wind. He'd been through storms before, but nothing like this. The yacht's engine sputtered and died, leaving them at the mercy of the waves. Water flooded the deck as another massive wave hit. Damien lost his footing and slammed into the rail. His head spun from the impact. Through the rain and darkness, he saw his beautiful yacht breaking apart. "Mr. Cross!" someone screamed. "The lifeboats!" But it was too late. A wall of water swept across the deck, taking Damien with it. He plunged into the icy ocean, struggling to keep his head above water. His expensive suit dragged him down as wave after wave crashed over him. "Help!" he tried to shout, but salt water filled his mouth. For the first time in his life, all his money meant nothing. He couldn't buy his way out of this. As consciousness slipped away, his last thought was of the waitress he'd thrown overboard. Now he knew how it felt. The darkness took him. Morning light filtered through Damien's eyelids. His head throbbed, and every muscle in his body ached. He could feel sand beneath him and hear waves lapping at the shore. Was he dead? Well, look who washed up. That voice. He knew that voice. Damien forced his eyes open and found himself staring up at Isla Reyes, the waitress he'd thrown off his yacht. She stood over him with her arms crossed, still wearing her wet server's uniform. "You?" he croaked. "Yes, me. The nothing you threw overboard." Isla's dark eyes flashed with anger. "How does it feel to be helpless, Mr. Cross?" Damien tried to sit up but fell back with a groan. His designer suit was torn and crusted with salt. His Rolex was gone. He had no phone, no wallet, nothing. "Where are we?" he asked. "Some island. I've been walking the beach all morning. No buildings, no people, no boats, just trees and rocks." Isla looked out at the endless blue ocean. "Looks like we're stuck here together." "Together?" Damien scoffed, though his voice was weak. "I don't need your help. I'll find my own way off this island." Isla laughed without humor. "Really? Can you make a shelter, find food, start a fire? Because I grew up camping with my dad, and I'm pretty sure those skills are more useful right now than knowing which fork to use at dinner." She was right, though Damien would never admit it. He could barely stand, let alone survive on his own. His head spun every time he moved. "You probably have a concussion," Isla said, noticing his dizziness. "I found some aloe plants that might help with your sunburn, and there's a freshwater stream inland." "Why are you helping me?" Damien asked. "After what I did? Because unlike you, I don't throw people away when they need help." She held out a coconut shell filled with water. "Drink this. Then we need to find shelter before the sun gets too high." Damien took the water, his hands shaking. Here he was, one of the richest men in New York, being saved by a waitress he'd treated like garbage. The irony wasn't lost on him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for throwing you overboard. Save your apologies. Right now we need to focus on staying alive." Isla helped him sit up. "Can you walk?" He nodded, though he wasn't sure. "Everything hurt?" "Good, because we've got a lot of work to do if we're going to survive here." She looked at his ruined suit. "And you might want to roll up those designer sleeves. They're not worth much on a deserted island." As Damien struggled to his feet, he realized something that shook him to his core. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. His money couldn't help him. His power meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was the strength and kindness of a woman he had dismissed as nothing. And somehow that terrified him more than the storm that had brought them here. The first few days on the island tested them both. Isla worked from sunrise to sunset, gathering wood, weaving palm fronds for shelter and searching for food. Damien tried to help, but his soft hands weren't used to manual labor. He got blisters just from picking up branches. "You're holding it wrong," Isla said, watching him struggle with a coconut. "Here, let me show you." She took the coconut and demonstrated how to crack it open with a sharp rock. Her movements were sure and confident, nothing like the nervous waitress from the yacht party. "Where did you learn all this?" Damien asked. "My dad was a survival instructor before he died. Every summer we'd go camping, and he'd teach me how to live off the land." She handed him half the coconut. Guess those lessons finally came in handy. Damien took a drink of the coconut water, remembering how he used to only drink coconut water that came in expensive bottles from trendy health stores. "My father only taught me one thing," he said quietly, "how to make money. And look how useful that is now." But Isla's voice had lost some of its sharpness. Maybe she saw something in his eyes, a hint of the lonely boy who'd grown up learning that money was all that mattered. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, Damien began to change. His designer suit hung in tatters, his perfectly styled hair grew wild, and his soft hands developed calluses. He learned to fish with a makeshift spear, to start fires with friction, to find edible plants. "Not bad," Isla said one evening as they ate the fish he'd caught. "You might survive on your own after all." "Thanks to you." Damien looked at her, across the fire. The flames lit up her face, and for the first time he really saw her. Not as a waitress or someone beneath him, but as a strong, beautiful woman who had saved his life. They developed a routine. Mornings were for gathering food and water. Afternoons for improving their shelter and searching for signs of rescue. Evenings were spent by the fire, talking. Isla told him about her mother's illness, how they'd lost their house paying medical bills, how she worked 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. "That's why I crashed your party," she admitted. "I heard those men talking about buying the diner and I just snapped. That place is all we have left." Damien felt shame burn in his chest. How many lives had he destroyed with his business deals? How many families had he hurt without even thinking about it? "If we get off this island," he said, "I'll make it right. I promise." Isla looked at him for a long moment. "You've changed. Had to. Money doesn't mean much when you're fighting to survive." One night, a terrible storm hit the island. Rain pounded their shelter as wind howled through the trees. Isla shivered in the darkness. Without thinking, Damien pulled her close, sharing his body heat. She stiffened at first, then relaxed against him. "Remember the last storm?" she whispered. "How could I forget? It's the night I lost everything." He paused and found something worth more. Lightning flashed, illuminating their faces. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. But before either could speak, a crack of thunder made them jump apart. The next morning, neither mentioned what had almost happened, but something had shifted between them. The wall of wealth and social status that had separated them was crumbling, replaced by something deeper and more real. They were no longer billionaire and waitress. They were just a man and a woman, surviving together on a lonely island, and maybe, just maybe, finding something they never expected to find. A connection that money couldn't buy and status couldn't touch. But as they grew closer, a question haunted them both. What would happen if rescue came? Would Damien return to his world of wealth and power? Would he remember the lessons he'd learned? Or would the island's magic fade away in the harsh light of reality? Neither wanted to ask. For now, they had the sound of waves, the warmth of the fire, and the comfort of knowing they weren't alone. Sometimes that was enough. Things changed the day Damien got sick. It started with a fever that made him shake despite the tropical heat. By nightfall, he could barely stand. "So you need to rest," Isla insisted, laying cool, wet leaves on his forehead. She'd learned about natural medicines from her grandmother, who used to make remedies from plants. Damien tossed and turned on his bed of palm leaves, muttering in his sleep. In his fever dreams, he was back in his office, signing papers that destroyed people's lives. He saw faces of employees he'd fired, families he'd made homeless, all for profit. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "I didn't know. I didn't see them as people." Isla stayed by his side for 3 days, barely sleeping. She made him drink tea from healing herbs, cooled his fever with wet cloths, and held his hand when nightmares made him cry out. On the 4th day, his fever broke. He woke to find Isla sleeping next to him, her hand still holding his. In the early morning light, she looked exhausted but peaceful. "Why did you help me?" he asked when she opened her eyes. "You could have let me die after everything I've done." "That's not who I am," she said simply, "and that's not who you are anymore either." She was right. The old Damien Cross was gone, washed away by the storm that brought them here. In his place was someone new, someone who felt things he'd never felt before. One morning they went fishing together at the lagoon. Isla stood in the shallow water, spear raised, waiting for fish to swim by. Sunlight danced on the water around her. "You're staring," she said without looking at him. "You're beautiful." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Isla's spear wavered. A fish darted away. She turned to look at him, surprise in her eyes. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't say things like that unless you mean them." "I do mean it." "I see you, Isla. not as a waitress or someone beneath me. I see you as the amazing woman you are." She shook her head. "And what happens if we get rescued? Will you still see me when you're back in your penthouse, or will I just be the help again?" Instead of answering, Damien waded through the water to her. He took the spear from her hands and let it float away. "I don't want that life anymore," he said. "All that money, that power, it made me cold, empty. These weeks with you have shown me what really matters." "Pretty words from a man who threw me overboard," Isla said, but her voice trembled. "I was a different man then. You changed me, Isla. You showed me kindness when I deserved cruelty. You taught me how to survive, how to live, how to—" He stopped, his heart pounding. How to what? How to love. The word hung between them like a fragile thing. Isla's eyes filled with tears. "Don't play with my heart, Damien. I couldn't bear it." He reached out, cupping her face in his calloused hands. "I've never been more serious in my life." When he kissed her, it wasn't like any kiss he'd known before. It was real, raw, full of truth. The water lapped around them as they held each other. Two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely place. That night, they lay together under the stars, their fingers intertwined. Damien told her about his childhood in boarding schools, about a father who measured love in dollar signs, about the loneliness that money couldn't fix. Isla told him about dancing in the diner kitchen with her mother, about Saturday mornings, at the park with her dad, about the richness of a life filled with love instead of luxury. "If rescue comes," Damien said, "I want you to know something. I'm not going back to who I was. I want to use my money to help people, not hurt them. And I want you with me." "As what?" Isla asked. "Your charity case?" "As my partner, my equal, my love." He turned to face her. "If you'll have me." Isla smiled through tears. The billionaire and the waitress. Sounds like a soap opera. Life is stranger than fiction. He kissed her softly, and much more wonderful. But fate wasn't finished with them yet, because at that very moment, on a distant shore, someone was organizing a rescue mission. Someone who had very different plans for Damien Cross and his fortune. The helicopter appeared on their 100th day on the island. Its blades cut through the peaceful morning air, shattering the world Damien and Isla had built together. "They found us," Isla shouted, waving her arms. But Damien didn't move. Something felt wrong. The helicopter landed on the beach, kicking up sand. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped out. Victor Ross, Damien's business partner. "Damien, thank God." Victor embraced him, then looked at his ragged appearance. "What happened to you?" "Life happened," Damien said. He reached for Isla's hand, but she had stepped back, suddenly aware of her torn clothes and tangled hair. "We need to get you back immediately," Victor said. "The company's in chaos. Your brother Richard has been making deals, selling assets." Richard? Damien's stomach dropped. His younger brother had always wanted control of the company. "He's claiming you're dead, that he's the rightful heir. We need to stop him before he destroys everything you built." Damien looked at Isla. She stood apart from them, arms crossed, already becoming invisible in the presence of these powerful men. "I'm not leaving without Isla," Damien said firmly. Victor glanced at her, dismissive. "Of course, we'll make sure the young lady gets home safely." The helicopter ride was tense. Isla sat silently while Victor briefed Damien on everything that had happened. Stock prices falling, board members taking sides, millions at stake. They landed at New York Presbyterian Hospital. Reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing. Someone threw a designer suit at Damien. In minutes, he was transformed back into the billionaire CEO. "Mr. Cross, is it true you were stranded with a waitress? Did she save your life? Are the romance rumors true?" Damien looked for Isla, but hospital staff had whisked her away for examination. He wanted to follow, but Victor pulled him into a conference room full of lawyers and board members. Hours passed in a blur of paperwork and discussions. By the time Damien escaped, Isla was gone. A nurse said she'd checked herself out. He found her at her mother's tiny apartment in Brooklyn. She was already back in her waitress uniform, like the island had been just a dream. "Isla, go back to your world, Damien." Her voice was tired. We both know this can't work. Why not? Everything I said on the island was true. Was it? Look, at you now, back in your suit running your empire. I saw how easily you slipped back into it. She wiped away a tear. I don't belong there. Then I'll leave it all. We can... No. She cut him off. You can't abandon your responsibilities. Your company employs thousands of people. What you do matters. You matter more. Do I? Or am I just a beautiful dream you had on an island? She touched his face gently. Go save your company, Damien. Use your power to help people like you promised. That's enough. He tried to argue, but she was right. His brother was destroying everything. People's jobs were at stake. He had responsibilities, but as he walked away from her door, Damien made a silent vow. This wasn't the end of their story. He'd proved to Isla that some dreams could survive in the real world. He just had to fight for what mattered most. And this time, it wasn't his money or his power. It was love. The battle for Cross Enterprises began the next morning. Damien walked into his old office, now occupied by his brother Richard, who barely looked up from the desk. Back from the dead, I see, Richard said coldly. Shame. Step down, Richard. The company's mine. Is it? The board's lost confidence. In you. 3 months playing Robinson Crusoe with a waitress. Richard smirked. They want stability, not some changed man with crazy ideas about helping people. Damien discovered how much damage Richard had done. Charitable programs cancelled. Long-time employees fired. Small businesses bought out and destroyed, including Isla's diner. The diner was nothing, Richard said when confronted. Just like your waitress. Damien's fist connected with his brother's jaw before he could stop himself. Security rushed in, but the damage was done. Richard pressed charges for assault. The media had a field day. Billionaire brothers brawl. Cross CEO unhinged after island ordeal. Romance with waitress ruins business dynasty. Isla saw the headlines at work. She'd found a job at another diner trying to rebuild her life. Her mother's medical bills kept piling up, and now they had no insurance since Richard cancelled the diner's employee benefits. Late one night, Victor Ross came to see her. Name your price, he said, sliding an envelope across the counter. Leave New York. Never contact Damien again. I haven't contacted him, Isla said, but you're distracting. Him. He's talking about changing company policies, giving away profits to charity. The board wants him declared mentally unfit after his trauma. Help him by letting him go. Isla pushed the envelope back. I can't be bought. Everyone has a price. Think about your mother's medical bills. The envelope stayed on the counter after Victor left. Inside was a check that could solve all her problems. All she had to do was break Damien's heart. Meanwhile, Damien fought back against his brother. He gathered evidence of Richard's illegal dealings, rallied loyal employees, and called in favors from other business leaders. You're really willing to risk everything? Victor asked him. For what? For what's right, Damien said. The money, the power, it means nothing if we don't use it to help people. The board meeting was set for Monday. Everything would be decided there. But on Sunday night, Damien got an anonymous envelope. Inside were photos of Isla meeting with Victor, the check on the table between them. It looked like a payoff. Damien's world spun. Had it all been a lie? Had she played him, making him weak when he needed to be strong? He drove to her apartment, the photos burning a hole in his pocket. She opened the door still in her diner uniform, looking tired. Did you take the money? He demanded. Isla's eyes fell on the photos in his hand. Where did you get those? Did you take it? No. Her voice was firm. But your friend tried hard to buy me off, just like you once thought everyone had a price. Damien deflated. I'm sorry, everything's falling apart. Richard's destroying the company. The board wants me out. I'm fighting so hard to change things, to be better, but nobody believes in me. I believe in you. Isla took his hand. That's why I didn't take the money. The man I fell in love with on that island, he's real and he's worth fighting for. Damien pulled her close, breathing in the scent of coffee and diner food. Come to the board meeting tomorrow. Help me show them what really matters. A waitress at a board meeting. a strong, beautiful woman who taught a lost billionaire how to be human again. What neither of them knew was that Richard was watching from his car across the street. And he had one last card to play, one that would test their love in ways they never imagined. The morning of the board meeting arrived with dark clouds threatening rain. Damien straightened his tie in his office mirror, remembering how he used to care so much about his appearance. Now his expensive suit felt like a costume. The elevator dinged. Isla stepped out, wearing a simple blue dress she'd borrowed from a friend. Even here, surrounded by wealth and power, she held her head high. "Ready?" she asked. "With you?" Always. They walked into the boardroom together. 20 pairs of eyes turned to stare. Richard sat at the head of the table, sporting a bruised jaw and a smug smile. "How nice of you to bring your friend," Richard said, "but this is a closed meeting, family and board members only." "She stays." Damien's voice left no room for argument. "She's more family than you've ever been." The meeting began. Numbers flashed across screens. Profits were up under Richard's leadership, but at what cost? Damien showed photos of demolished family businesses, lists of fired employees, cancelled community programs. "Business isn't charity," Richard argued. "We're here to make money. We're here to build something worthwhile," Damien countered. "Something that helps people, not just stockholders." The board members shifted uncomfortably. They'd never seen this side of Damien Cross. Then Richard played his trump card. "Speaking of helping people," he pressed a button and new images appeared on the screens. They showed Isla's mother leaving a private medical facility. "Such a shame," Richard said. "A waitress's mother getting experimental treatment she'll never afford. Unless, What did you do?" Isla whispered. "I paid for her treatment. Every penny." Richard smiled at Damien. "While you were making speeches about helping people, I actually helped someone. For a price, of course." He slid a document across the table. "Sign control of the company over to me, brother, or I cancel the treatment. I doubt a waitress's salary could cover it." The boardroom went silent. Isla's hands trembled. "You're trying to blackmail me with an innocent woman's life?" Damien's voice shook with rage. "I'm showing the board who you really are. You talk about helping people, but what will you sacrifice? Your power, your company, everything you've worked for." "Sign it, Damien," Isla said quietly. "My mother's life is worth more than any company." Damien picked up the pen. The old him would have chosen power every time, but the island had changed him. Love had changed him. "You're right, Richard," he said. "Business isn't charity." He put the pen down. "It's responsibility. To employees, to communities, to people." He turned to the board. "My brother shows you profits. I'll show you purpose. Yes, helping people costs money, but destroying lives costs more. Every family business we crush, every employee we fire, every community we damage, it has a price. Not in dollars, but in human cost." "Pretty words," Richard scoffed. "But words don't pay bills." "No," said a new voice. Everyone turned. Victor Ross stood in the doorway, holding a stack of papers. "But fraud charges do." He dropped the papers on the table. "Wire transfers, offshore accounts, falsified records, all traced back to you, Richard. You've been stealing from the company for years." Richard lunged for the documents, but security guards grabbed him. "You betrayed me?" he snarled at Victor. "I betrayed greed," Victor said. "Damien's right, it's time for change." The board voted unanimously. Richard was out. Damien would remain CEO with a mandate to reform the company's practices. "The treatment stays," Damien told Isla afterward. "No strings attached. And the diner will reopen, with better benefits than before." Isla hugged him, crying. "You risked everything." "No," he said, holding her close. "I almost lost everything on that island, but I found what really matters." Outside, the rain had stopped. A rainbow arched over the city, promising something new, something better. But they still had one more storm to weather, because Richard Cross didn't go quietly when he was arrested. And his last act of revenge would test their love one final time. From his jail cell, Richard made one phone call. Within hours, every newspaper in New York had the same headline: "Cross CEO's Island Romance, the Real Story." The articles painted Ela as a gold digger who'd planned everything. They claimed she'd snuck onto the yacht deliberately, knowing about the coming storm. That she'd chosen the island, prepared it in advance, all to trap New York's richest bachelor. Sources close to the family provided fake evidence, photos of Ela meeting with suspicious men before the yacht party, bank records showing mysterious deposits. Even her mother's illness was questioned. Damien found Isla at her mother's hospital room, crying over the papers. "How could they write such lies?" she asked. "Richard knows the media. He knows money can buy any story." Damien sat beside her. "But we know the truth, do we? Your high society friends are already whispering. The board members who voted for... You are having doubts. Maybe Richard's right. Maybe I'm just ruining your life." "You saved my life," Damien said firmly, "and not just on that island." But the scandal grew. Reporters camped outside Ela's apartment. Old friends sold fake stories about her past. Someone leaked her mother's private medical records. "End it with him," Richard's lawyer told her during a prison visit. "Publicly. Say it was all a lie. We'll pay you more than you'd ever get from him." "Why are you doing this?" Isla asked. "Because my client knows his brother. Damien's weak heart will choose love over business. The board will remove him and then..." The lawyer smiled coldly. "Well, someone has to run the company." Isla walked out without answering. But the pressure kept building. Her mother's doctors started acting strange, hinting at problems with insurance. The diner's reopening was delayed by mysterious permit issues. One night, she packed a bag. It would be easier for everyone if she just disappeared. But when she opened her door, Damien was there. "Running away?" he asked softly. "How did you know?" "Because I know you. You'd sacrifice your happiness to protect others. Just like you took care of me on that island." He took her hand, led her to his car. They drove through the city's empty streets. "Where are we going?" "To fight back your way, with truth and kindness." They pulled up at a small diner, not hers, but similar. Inside, dozens of people waited. Former employees Richard had fired, small business owners he'd crushed, families whose lives he'd damaged. "Tell your stories," Damien said to them, "not to the newspapers, to each other, to social media, to everyone who will listen." One by one they shared the real stories of Richard's cruelty, of lives destroyed by corporate greed. And slowly the true story emerged. How Richard had been embezzling money for years, how he'd bribed officials, threatened employees, destroyed evidence. The yacht accident wasn't the beginning of their story. It was just when Richard's plans started falling apart. "My brother thought love made me weak," Damien told reporters the next day. "But love made me see the truth about him, about business, about what really matters." The tide turned. Richard's lies fell apart. The board's doubts faded. And Isla stood tall through it all, showing the same strength she'd had on the island, the strength that had saved them both. But one final test remained. Because sometimes the biggest storms come when you least expect them, and sometimes the truest love is proven not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments of choice. The invitation arrived on heavy cream paper with gold lettering. The governor's charity ball, the biggest social event of the year. Damien had to attend as CEO. The question was, would Isla go with him? "It's time," he said, showing her the invitation. "Time to show everyone who we really are." Isla touched the expensive paper nervously. "Your world still scares me." "It's not my world anymore. We'll build our own." The night of the ball arrived. Isla wore a simple blue gown that made her look like a princess. But as they walked up the grand steps, she squeezed Damien's hand hard. Inside, New York's elite stared and whispered. Old money turned their backs. Society women who'd once chased Damien now snubbed them both. "Mrs. Cartwright," Damien greeted an elderly woman who'd been his mother's friend. "You remember Isla?" The waitress. She looked Isla up and down. "How quaint." All night the whispers followed them. "Gold digger, social climber, not our kind." Then the governor himself approached. "Damien, we've missed you at these events." "Governor, meet Isla Reyes." The governor smiled warmly. "The young lady who saved New York's most eligible bachelor? I've been wanting to meet you," he drew Isla aside. asking about her mother's health foundation, the charity Damien had set up in her name. Soon other guests drifted over, curious. Isla told them about the diner, about growing up poor but loved, about teaching Damien to fish with a makeshift spear. Her simple honesty charmed them. "You've changed him," the governor's wife said later. "He used to be so cold, now he smiles, he cares." But not everyone was charmed. A group of board members cornered Damien. "Think of the company's image," one warned. "A CEO can't marry a waitress." "Marry?" Isla had walked up behind them. Her face went pale. "I was going to ask you tonight," Damien said softly. "Not like this." Isla ran. Out of the ballroom, into the garden. Damien found her by a fountain, crying. "I can't do this," she said. "I can't. Be what they want. I don't want you to be anything but yourself." He knelt beside her. "On that island, you taught me what matters. Not money or power or status, just love. Real love." He pulled out a small box. Inside wasn't a massive diamond, but a simple pearl. A ring. "I found this pearl on the beach our last day there," he said. "I've carried it ever since, waiting for the right moment." "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Like you, simple, natural, real." He took her hand. "Isla Reyes, will you marry me? Not the billionaire CEO, but the man you taught to survive, to live, to love." She looked at the pearl, remembering their island. Then at the glittering ballroom behind them. Two worlds, seemingly so far apart. But maybe they weren't. Maybe love could bridge any distance. "Yes," she said, "but only if we do things our way." Inside, the party continued. The whispers went on. But they didn't matter anymore. Because sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about fancy parties or expensive rings. Sometimes they're about two people who find each other in the most unexpected places and choose each other despite every obstacle. And sometimes happily ever after isn't about living in a perfect world. It's about building your own world, together. The wedding wasn't at a grand cathedral or luxury hotel. They held it at Isla's reopened diner. Christmas lights twinkled above the booths, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with flowers. Regular customers sat beside board members in the vinyl seats. Isla wore her mother's dress, simple and beautiful. Damien wore a suit, but with the tie loose and comfortable. They said their vows between the counter and the kitchen where Isla had grown up. "I take you," Damien said. "Not because you saved my life, but because you gave me a new one." "I take you," Isla answered. "Not despite who you were, but because of who you've become." Her mother cried happy tears from her wheelchair. She was getting stronger every day, thanks to the treatment. The diner's new health insurance covered everything. The governor gave a speech about love crossing boundaries. Victor Ross raised a toast with a cup of diner coffee. Even some of the society ladies who'd once snubbed Isla were there, won over by her genuine heart. After the ceremony, Damien had a surprise. He'd bought the empty lot next door. For a community center, he explained. Free childcare for working parents, job training, medical clinic, everything this neighborhood needs. "Our first project together," Isla smiled. They honeymooned on their island. The helicopter dropped them off with proper camping gear this time. They spent 2 weeks living simply, remembering where their love began. One night, lying under the stars, Damien said, "Sometimes I wonder if Richard did us a favor causing that accident, by trying to kill us, by helping me find you, find myself." A year later, they welcomed twins, a boy and girl. They named the girl Pearl, after Isla's engagement ring. The boy they named David, after Isla's father, who taught her the survival skills that saved them. The babies spent their first months in a cradle beside Isla's mother's chair in the diner. Customers became family. Board meetings sometimes happened in booths over pie and coffee. Richard watched it all from prison, his bitter heart unchanged. But his power was gone. The truth had set them all free. One morning, Damien found Isla in the diner kitchen, teaching their toddlers how to flip pancakes. Pearl had batter in her hair. David was more interested in eating the chocolate chips. "Look at this mess," Isla laughed. Damien picked up a dish towel to help clean. He didn't miss his old life of perfect order and cold luxury. This beautiful chaos was worth more than all his billions. "I love you," he said simply. "Even with pancake batter in my hair? Especially then." They kissed while the twins giggled and their coffee got cold. Outside, the city rushed by. Inside was their own perfect world. The diner's bell rang as new customers came in. Life went on, bringing its mix of joys and challenges. But they faced it together, remembering what they'd learned on that distant shore. That love isn't about status or money or power. It's about seeing someone's true self and choosing them every day. It's about building something real together, even if others don't understand. Sometimes the greatest treasures are found in life's storms. Sometimes the longest journeys lead you exactly where you need to be. And sometimes true love is just a shipwreck away. The end.